What's happening, everybody? So, what is a muscle car anyway? With all the talk about EVs, e-muscle, especially coming from Mopar, and with all the other manufacturers really diving into this EV culture and EV powertrain, what is a muscle car again? Can somebody please remind me? Well, if you look up the definition would tell you that it's an American-made, powerful coupe, primarily focused on drag racing, or at least it'll mention drag racing in the definition, depending on which dictionary you look it up in. But that's really not the full definition, is it? It lacks the essence, it lacks the spirit of what makes a muscle car. So, what is a muscle car? Well, the thing is that it also begs a secondary question, because when you're talking about EV, folks will say, friends and fans of the internal combustion will say, well, that's not a real muscle car. And that's kind of an odd statement. Where and when did the muscle car originate then, if that EV is not a muscle car, if it doesn't fit the definition of two doors, or at least maybe four doors if we don't want to be too specific to the definition? A very powerful vehicle that is really good at going really fast in a straight line. You could almost boil the definition down to just that statement, and in that case, some of these EVs are more muscly in terms of being muscle cars. They're certainly more muscle bound, or at least have the legs to get the job done better than internal combustion engines. So how could they not be real muscle? The other thing is, when did the muscle car originate? What was the original muscle car? And when guys are referring to old school muscle cars, well, which ones are they talking about? It's 2023, almost anyway. And the idea of old school kind of starts to take on a bit of a new flavor. So if I hear somebody say, it's not a real muscle car, it's not old school muscle. Some guys are like that. And they don't really believe that even the modern muscle cars would be considered muscle cars. But which muscle cars are they talking about? Well, let's dive in and examine some old school muscle cars. And I'm not talking about old school from the 90s, old school from the 80s or 70s. Heck, I'm not even talking about old school from the 60s, which would be the kind of common ground that most folks would want to talk about muscle cars. When you're talking about a timeline, that's where you're going to find yourself. But even back then, in the 60s, there were guys that were fans of the old school muscle. And this was a guy that would be talking about, say, a 58 or a 57 Dodge or DeSoto with a Gen 1 Hemi. Or these could be guys that had just come back from war and they were buying these jalopies, these 1932, 1933 Model B Fords, the Type 18, if you will, with that first cast block flathead V8, that V8 Ford. And kind of a side story, I remember my grandmothers talking about the V8 Ford. In fact, it was a thing. You just called them the V8 Ford, and their brothers that had gotten back from overseas, when they bought these jalopies and they would hot rod them, the sound of the V8 Ford and what it felt like to ride in these quick little fast muscly cars, as they would call them. The funny thing is that would still be considered a muscle car by the definition. Remember, American-made, two-door, main purpose is to go fast in a straight line. That goes all the way back to the 30s, at least, with the V8s, with the Fords, and the V8s were even out before then, but the idea was a V8 that was affordable to the masses. So does a muscle car have to also be affordable? And what designates affordability anyway? Well, that's going to be something that's more personal and subjective than objective, I suppose. But we can still talk about old school in that respect. So the fact that we're talking about muscle from the 30s or the 40s, and these guys saying, well, these supercars now are just way overpowered. They're not really all that when you consider the fact that what they were doing with these engines from back in the 40s and the 50s, and a lot of these guys were more Bonneville than Boulevard racers. So again, I have to ask you guys, what designates that muscle car status? Well, for a lot of folks, it has to have a 1960s birth date. And for a lot of folks, it's got to have a big block. Because what is a muscle car without the muscle behind it? See, a lot of folks would be, I guess, forgiven, if you would, to feel like a 396 Camaro is a muscle car. And in a way it kind of is, and in a way it kind of isn't, right? But it only would be because it's got a big block, but it's the smaller car. Does that still make it a muscle car? Or does it make it a pony car because it's in line sight with the Mustang in terms of being a competitor? I mean, it certainly isn't an intermediate sized car, and that's really what more folks would call a muscle car, an intermediate with a big block. Okay, now we're really starting to define terms. But what's a big block? I mean, is a big block a 440 cubic inch engine? Would the 383 Mopar be considered a big block? Well, yeah, it would, because, well, it's just a short deck version of the RB block in the 440, but Chevrolet had a 400 cubic inch small block. I mean, it was never a performance variant, but you can kind of get the idea. And if you want to go even further back with Mopars, back to the late mid 50s, there was the RB block that was 350 cubic inches, the same cubic inch displacement as what you would find in any generic Nova or Camaro, Malibu, or maybe a 351 in a Mustang. So it can't be based on cubic inches. It's got to be a big cubic inch number, though, to really conjure up the idea and the thoughts of muscle car. So what would be a muscle car? Well, something like any of the B-body Mopars, a Chevelle from Chevrolet, a Torino from Ford, or a Galaxy 500, if you will, but not necessarily the Cuda or the Barracuda. The Mustang doesn't fall into that either. The Camaro doesn't necessarily fall into that guise as well, even though you could get them with big blocks. And I guess if you could get them with a 427 in the Camaro, like a Copo, or a 428 as far as the Mustang is concerned with like a Shelby GT500, or maybe even a 440 Challenger, well, I guess you could still call that a muscle car, even though it's a muscle car engine in a pony car body. Oh, it just gets so confusing. And so then you have to advance the conversation, because as those cars went out of production and the name and what would be called muscle car started to be attributed to those cars from the 60s. Remember, at that point in time, the big block powered variants of all these cars were really called supercars. They really weren't called muscle cars even in their own era. So then you get into the 70s. Well, there aren't any real muscle cars built in the 70s, but you did have 400 cubic inch cars that were still being made. The Trans Am is really the only one that'll come to mind for most folks, but you still had kind of muscle cars with, you know, like the Dodge Magnum. I think you could get that with a 400. I know that the Roadrunner was still running around. At one point, you could get that with that 400, which is basically just a low deck big block. But the reality is that muscle kind of made a comeback at one point. And there was the much maligned malaise era that we're talking about now, those disco era muscly looking cars. But what about the 80s? Are there any real muscle cars in the 80s? Remember that this is a point in time where cars were, well, they didn't have a big block. And remember, we were just talking about muscle in the terms of, well, if it's got a big block and two doors, it's probably a muscle car by default. Well, you didn't have that really in the 70s. In the 80s, you definitely didn't. So do cars like the Grand National, which was a V6 with a turbo that looked the part and ran the part but didn't have a V8 at all, is that still a muscle car? Well, if you look at it, you would say absolutely it is. And it's smaller, or at least cousins, smaller siblings, the T-Type, which actually there was a variant that was lighter than the Grand National that was faster than the Grand National, but we won't really get too deep into that. But what about the Trans Am that also shared the same 3.8 liter single turbo? Or what about the Cyclone and the Typhoon? These are two mini trucks that had 4.3 liter V6s with turbos. Would those be muscle cars or muscle trucks? I guess, is the argument going to be that it's the most technologically advanced, most powerful engine in whatever package it's put into? And let's kind of rewind it back a little bit more, late 70s, early 80s. What about the Little Red Express and the Warlock pickup trucks from Dodge? Those are trucks, and they were the fastest motor vehicles on the road at the time. Some kind of clever emissions trickery there. Trucks didn't have to follow the same rules as cars for emissions. So because of that, they could put a hotter small block in those trucks. They were faster than some of the muscle cars at the time. Does that make them muscle cars, even though they're trucks? Kind of curious. And then you get into the 90s. Well, the LS revolution began. And would any of those cars be considered muscle cars with the Camaro or, well, everything else that was powered by that LS engine? Then you get into the 2000s. Any of the Hemi-powered contraptions, are they considered muscle cars by you guys? The funny thing is that you've got guys that will swear that the modern cars are not muscle enough because they don't have enough cubic inches, only to then say that a car like the 392 Challenger is, well, yes, a muscle car, even though it doesn't really fit the bill, even though it's the size of a B-body Mopar and has an engine that's practically 400 cubic inches, although it's more of a stroker small block than it is a big block. This is where guys really start to get confused, especially when you start to compare it to cars like the Mustang GT versus the GT 500. You see how the argument just starts to swim in its own excrement, if you will. It's an interesting argument and it's an interesting topic, but the problem is that it's so circular. And remember when I said that the American muscle car is just that, an American-made coupe with a powerful engine that's designed to go really fast in a straight line. Well, what about the Australian variants? I mean, the XB Falcon, for starters, Mad Max's car wasn't a muscle car. I would beg to differ. And that's not even an American designed car, although it's got an American V8. So again, looking at the, well, powerful engine, there's nobody designating whether or not that has to be a V8. So Mark IV Supra, any of the Japanese variants, lots of power, but it's a 6-cylinder. Can the car be a muscle car if it's a 6-cylinder? We asked the same question about the Grand National and the T-types. The same could apply for something from a different country. Again, these are cars that would run fast or faster than their old school muscle counterparts, but they've got completely different powertrain configurations. And also, there's nothing in the definition that designates rear-wheel drive only. You know, we mentioned the Cyclone and the Typhoon. Those were all-wheel drive. Everything else we've been talking about has been rear-wheel drive, but what about front-wheel drive cars? What about the Toronado? Like, this is going from back in the day. That was a front-wheel drive personal luxury car. Just so happens it would smoke the front tires for basically as long as you kept your foot in the throttle. But move that thought into the 80s a little bit. Remember that this is a point in time where everybody said that the V8 was going away. And now we had cars like the Omni GLH, the Daytona Turbo, cars that were every bit as fast as their V8 brethren in a straight line and were front-wheel drive. Are those muscle cars? Where does the argument start to break down? So the question is the EV not a muscle car? Think of it like this. Most EVs that you can think of off the top of your head that aren't built as a little city car are quicker and faster than all of the golden era muscle cars that you can rattle off the top of your head. Yes, even that one. provided that it's not a factory spec race version of that car, chances are the pedestrian version of the EV that is rolling around in the neighborhood on the street right behind where you live is quicker than that particular car. So, are we just talking about power plants, or are we talking about a mindset? Are we talking about a lifestyle? Now, you can argue that point until you're blue in the face, but the reality is, in the modern era that we're living in, you've got EV owners that are going out and trolling internal combustion engine owners, and they're beating them at their own game. Listen, I'm not here to try to push an EV narrative. I'm not a big fan of EVs myself. I see a lot of flaws in the logic, and I know a little bit more about the engineering behind them to know that they are not going to be reliable long term with some of the issues that they've been seeing so far. But from just a pure performance standpoint, you could probably say the same thing about 60s muscle cars. Think of how reliable they were and what kind of shape they were in 5, 10, 12 years after they were released. I think you guys know what I'm talking about. Post up your comments. Let me know what you think. What are your ideas? What are your thoughts? What is a muscle car to you? Is it true for you that internal combustion can be the only way to a muscle car? Or do you see that where an EV might have its place? What about hybrids? Does that get you going at all? You know, that extra power boost could make that hybrid not only faster than its internal combustion counterpart, but give every EV that it runs across a fine run for its money as well. Is that muscle to you guys? Let me know what you think. We'll catch y'all on the next one. That's a wrap. Adios.